All right, thank you. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our second Oregon Cost Growth Target data submission training webinar. Next slide, please. All right. So hi. Oh, I don't think I introduced myself. My name's Trang Weidemeyer. I'm the policy lead for the Oregon Cost Growth Target Program. A couple notes before we get into the nitty-gritty. This training is being recorded, and we are, just like last year, going to post this online on the data submission webpage for you all to review again or send to staff who weren't able to make it to the training today. Please, if you haven't already, go ahead and list your name and the organization you are affiliated with. And as I mentioned a minute or two ago, there is going to be space for questions at the end and in a couple spots as we go through the webinar slide deck. Next slide, please. All right. So first things first, who is this training for? This training is specifically for the technical staff of payer/data reporter organizations. These are the organizations who will be compiling and submitting to OHA the 2022 cost growth target data files. Reminder, those files are due September 2nd this year. That's the first Friday in September. The purpose of this training is to give kind of an overview of technical submission requirements. We're going to go through the cost growth target template. All the mandatory reporters this year were also reporters last year, so hopefully some repeating faces. And if you're new, welcome. There has been a couple changes to the template we'll call out in this webinar, but it's largely the layout has stayed the same. So we're gonna kind of walk through what the template looks like. We're also going to talk about the data submission manual, which is the first source of data submission questions. We're going to specifically call attention to a couple areas where payers are able to customize their data wrangling in order to submit it into the file to OHA. Next slide. And I'll also note the only data reporters are insurance carriers, payers. Okay. So this is an overview of the agenda. We're just gonna quickly go through how this program was started. We implemented data collection for the first time last year. And then we'll jump into the file submission schedule and then do a breakdown of what data is captured. We'll walk through the template, what the template looks like. There are some new data validation tabs. We'll also go through the manual highlighting specific areas where payers can customize their data. And lastly, we'll review how to submit the data to OHA, and we'll also review our new data validation process, which we have updated extensively from last year. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the overview of the program, but we always like to start off these with kind of a national view of these cost growth target programs. Can you go to the next slide? If you will notice, this map is slowly expanding. Sorry if you can't see some of those filled patterns, but what this slide is essentially showing is we are not alone in having this type of cost growth target program in our state. And we're certainly not alone in collecting the data this way. Oregon is the 4th state in the nation to stand up a program of this kind. And as you can see, it's spreading bit by bit, state to state, across the US, as people want to have a better handle on how much healthcare costs, and trying to understand those spending trends. Next slide, please. Okay, so this cost growth target program was established in 2019 in our Senate Bill 889. The original discussion of this work, however, was actually back in 2017 with Senate Bill 419, which stood up this interim task force on healthcare costs. They originally were looking at a rate setting program, a hospital rate setting program in Oregon. Ultimately, folks decided to go on this route, setting a target for total per capita spending that would apply to payers and provider organizations across the state. So that's how we have our sustainable cost growth target program. The aim is to create a more affordable, sustainable healthcare system, and we have 4 kind of high arching goals to help achieve that. Number 1 is through cost transparency. Number 2 is setting a sustainable growth target. That's that 3.4% target you will hear us talking about by market, commercial, Medicare, Medicaid. Third goal is to get healthcare spending reported so we can monitor this on a total cost of care approach. And we'll be going into more detail on how this program operationalizes that total cost of care approach. And lastly, it's just setting everything up so multiple stakeholders in the healthcare system have a common goal. If you would like to read more about this program, you can look at, there's a whole bunch of resources on our program webpage, including the Implementation Committee's final recommendations report, which was submitted to the legislature early last year. And the link to that webpage is on this slide. It's also going to be mentioned again later on the final resources slide. Next slide, please. So how does this program operate? Well, it's not just a target. It's not just setting a target. You could look at this annual program cycle to get a sense of all the different types of activities the CGT program will undertake. And it all starts with data submission. So we have to measure healthcare spending first, right? So that's where these data submissions come in. We start right at the very beginning to collect the data, analyze it, measure it against that statewide cost growth target. And then there's going to be an annual cycle of validating the data, reporting the data, and then working with multiple entities to identify opportunities to control and slow spending growth. I'm not going to get into that. There is a governance committee associated with this program, the advisory committee, that is also heavily involved in this work and will direct a lot of this stuff. Next slide, please. So this program collects data on an annual basis. Last year, it was in October, but starting with this year onward, files are due to OHA the first Friday in September. So for the next 3 years, we have the dates here, and we will keep reminding you folks so you don't forget, because the actual date does change, but it's always the first Friday in September. So this year it's September 2nd, and the data submission should include data covering spending in calendar years 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get into some of the exciting stuff. Next slide. Oh, well, before I start this, after doing the general overview and recap, are there any questions from webinar attendees?
No.
All right, here we go. Okay, so zooming out, how is this program going to collect healthcare spending, and what is healthcare spending? So overall, this schematic will show people that our total, what we are calling total healthcare expenditures, THCE, you can kind of bisect into two types of data. Total medical expenses on the left-hand side and net cost of private health insurance on the right-hand side. In terms of data submission to the Cost Growth Target Program, everything we're talking about in this webinar, you're going to be looking at the left-hand part of this schematic. Total medical expenses are further divided into two buckets. There are claims payments that we collect in the data submission template, and there are also a set of non-claims payments we collect. TME is a component of total healthcare expenditures, but our program collects NCPHI separately. Next slide. So to zoom out and think about whose spending is captured in this program. So we broke it down a little bit. So first of all, this is health spending data for Oregon residents who are insured by you, the payer, and where you, the payer, are the primary payer for that member. There is a little asterisk, which I'll talk about in a minute. So it's Oregon residents, payers are the primary payer for, and we collect spending in three main, what we're calling markets: Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial. And it's health spending from any payer in or outside of Oregon. We are not including out-of-state residents who receive care from Oregon providers. So I do want to note this little asterisk here for primary payer. This is a change in reporting guidance from last year. So if you're a payer, you are the primary payer for the member, and you should report that member spending in this data template. However, because of the funkiness in duals expenses in Oregon, and I'm not going to get into that too much, except to say that Medicaid CCOs, who are the secondary payer for duals expenses, should also report those costs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more further down the line. That's only relevant for Medicaid CCO dual spending. Next slide. Some of you will recognize this slide as our triangle slide. I would say maybe don't concentrate too much on this slide. This is just a representation of dollars in the health insurance medical expense universe. It's certainly not everything. And mainly this is just to show folks the dollars we are collecting in the program, and that this program does not aim to collect every single dollar in the whole health system universe. And another note I'll say about this is that it's important to, yes, payers following the guidance and specifications, but also making sure that each payer in their individual cost growth target file is consistently reporting in the same way year to year. The goal of this, after all, is to understand the trend of healthcare costs, and then we can dig down into exploring those trends if they need exploring. So let's go to the next slide and get into the data submission template. Next slide. So this was released in late May to our 2022 data submitters. Everything is linked on our data submission webpage. I just want to go over the template structure. There are a lot more tabs. Well, not a lot. There are basically 4 new tabs to the data submission template. So right now we've color coded them. You'll see the first 7 tabs, and they're numbered 1 through 7, are colored orange. And these are tabs where the payer will be inputting data. We'll go through tab by tab in just a couple minutes, but these orange tabs are the input tabs for folks looking at this. The next couple tabs are lookup tables. They're coded blue, so we have codes for line of business we use. We have the codes we use for attribution hierarchy, and we have a new reference tab for demographic factors. We'll get into that in a little bit, but this demographic tables tab is provided by OHA. They'll have demographic adjustment factors for payer staff to apply to their membership. We have factors by age band, sex, and line of business, and you can take a peek at that. The last 3 tabs are our data validation tabs. This is the last section of the webinar, data validation, so I'm not gonna review them right now, but we will color code them in a teal color, so look out for that. Let's go to the next slide. So if you submitted data to us last year, or if you are a payer that submits this data to other states, you'll know that the tabs in these submission templates are related. We made a little schematic of how they're related, but there's multiple ways to chop up the data and to ensure that the file is formatted and all the spending is allocated correctly. We do have to do a lot of validation to look at those inter-tab relationships and the integrity of the data. A lot of these validation checks you will be able to do yourself with this data template. So that's a really exciting change. And we'll talk about these relationships later. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to screen sharing the new data submission template. There are a whole bunch of slides in this PowerPoint, which you can view later. And some of the slides will go into more detail, but right now I'm going to switch to this data template. It will have, I think, a little bit of mock data in it. And this mock data Excel file will be posted under the training material. So please give me a minute while I switch over. Okay. Can somebody confirm verbally that the Excel?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay. So here, running along the bottom, you can see all the different tabs we have. I'm on the contents tab. We just saw a slide with this information. And we have our 7 input tabs in orange. We have our 3 lookup table reference tabs. And then we have a couple validation tabs at the end. So I know last year, I think I spent a long time talking about the cover page tab. So I'm not going to do that this year. I do just want to go over it really briefly. This is the tab where before payers submit to OHA, there are a series of questions you need to answer for us, and it lets us know that you compiled the data correctly. If there was some payer specific way you compiled the data, because as I mentioned at the top, there is payer flexibility in reporting for some things. This is space for you to share some comments about how you did that. So at the top, we just have general contact information. We have our attestation. This doesn't necessarily, the attestation of that the data is correct and ready for submission. It doesn't need to be like a C-level suite. It just needs to be, you know, someone at a high enough level in the organization that can attest to the data. So I know we're like, I think a little more general with this part of our data submission versus other states, but there was some confusion on who should be the person to fill this out. So that's that. Starting with row 14, there's going to be a couple tables. One table that is not in here is the risk adjustment questions, because we are not using clinical risk adjustment anymore. So that definitely will save time in filling this page out. The tables we do have and need to be answered. We have one for data completeness and estimation. Some of the response cells you'll see have a drop-down menu if we're looking for a yes, no. If not, it'll be a free text field. And of course, you could always give us more information you feel is needed for our review of your data file using the cells in the comments column. So the first table are questions about the data completeness, whether you estimated some data. The second table is on data inclusion and exclusion. The third is some standard deviation questions to ensure that the standard deviation calculation was executed correctly. And then lastly, we have the same income from fees of uninsured plans as last year. So that's the cover page. I don't think we had any big issues with this last year that I need to call out right now. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll head into the TME tabs, starting with TME all. So tab 2, 3, and 4, we call those the TME tabs, the total medical expenses tab. They're TME all you can kind of think of as the overall look, just the overall snapshot of your spending stratified by reporting year and line of business. A lot of the data elements, most of the data elements are going to be the same among the 3 TME tabs: TME all, provider, and unattributed. TME all has all the health spending of your members. Your member months will be, you know, your total member months. You'll notice in TME all, there are no provider organization data labels because we're only stratifying by reporting year and line of business. Here's our new demographic score data field. It operates pretty much the same way the old risk score field operated, only when doing the calculations, you'll use you'll apply factors from this demographic tables tab. We have the same claims categories. There are 9 claims categories that you'll allocate spending to. If we scroll down, we'll hit the non-claims. There are 6 non-claims payment categories. And lastly, we'll hit a couple auto-populated data columns. You do not have to do anything to these columns. They're just auto-populated for you, for us in the templates. And I believe they're locked, so you shouldn't be able to do anything. All right. If you look at the top, we have the data element name in row 7. We also have a short little descriptor in row 8. There are some formatting checks in this tab. You can see up here when the payer enters data that doesn't meet the desired format, the cell will change color. It'll turn red. You can see in our claims data columns, it won't accept a non-negative number. Well, I mean, it will accept a negative number, but the cell will turn red because we're looking for a positive number. I hope I said that correctly. All right, so that's the TME All tab. So this is your whole book of business for those members of that year. We further chop up this health spending into attributed providers and unattributed spending that you can attribute to a provider and spending that you cannot attribute to a provider organization, excuse me. So let's get into that. Those are tabs 3 and tab 4. So now I'm going into tab 3, TME Prov. So this spending is a subset of TME All. This is spending that you, the payer, are able to attribute to a provider organization using one of 3 attribution hierarchy codes. So if you are able to do that attribution, you will have a new data field here called provider organization name, where you'll give us, this is a free text field, so you'll give us the name of the provider organization, and you'll give us the spending of members that were attributed to that provider organization. This is stratified by year, line of business, and also attribution hierarchy code. So if you had members attributed to hospital system Z, also in 2020, also in line of business code 3, but they were attributed to hospital system Z using attribution code 2, that would be a completely new row in this spreadsheet. So that's how this data is structured. One thing I'll want to point out, because I think most of you are repeat data reporters, we removed the fields right in between here. We removed the fields provider first name, provider last name. Those were optional fields last year in case the provider organization was rolled up to an individual, and we thought that might, be able to help us with attribution. It mainly caused confusion. So we only have a provider organization name. This is a free text field. If you have an attributed provider that's an individual, you can put their name in here, however makes sense for your system. It could be Trang space Weidemeyer, Weidemeyer space Trang. We're pretty agnostic to that. The main thing we want to ensure is that whatever value is in this provider org name, that value is matched in the provider ID tab. That's actually one of the validation checks we do. So as long as each provider org in here, be it an actual organization or an individual, each one should exist in the 7th tab, Prov ID. We'll go over that a little bit later, and with corresponding TINs. So going through, I'll scroll a little bit to the right, because in Prov ID, we do have a field that we don't have in TME All, and that is the standard deviation. We'll go through standard deviation a little bit more further in the webinar, but we do collect a demographic adjusted standard deviation for spending in these provider attributed rows. So that is spending that can be attributed to a provider entity. That subset of spending will be in tab 3. If there is a subset of spending for some members that you cannot attribute to a provider entity, you will report that in tab 4, TME unattributed. I believe this should look exactly like TME All. There are no provider entity data fields in here. We just have stratifying the data by reporting year and line of business, and then it's just the sum of all that spending. This field also has a demographic adjusted standard deviation. All right, so moving on to, actually, no, excuse me. This is the point where we get into standard deviation. So standard deviation is reported for tab 3 and tab 4. And we had a couple of questions about how this looked, and just to make sure we were all on the same page, our program created a supplemental Excel sheet that really breaks down standard deviation, created by yours truly, Yishan Sung. It's posted to our webpage. It's already been edited with the new file format of 2022. So right now, I am going to screen share that while Yishan walks us through that document. Okay. All right. If you can see it, Yishan, you could start.
Yeah, thank you, Tram. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yishan Song, a research analyst with Oregon Healthcare Cost Growth Target Program. So for this standard deviation, we collect the standard deviation. The purpose is to calculate the confidence interval for the cost growth rate from one year to another, and we use that confidence interval to make sure if your growth rate is really over the 3.4% for now, to make sure you are really over the target or not. So the standard calculations for this year is very similar to the one in last year, but there are two things probably slightly different from last year. One is that we switch from risk scores to the demographic scores. You will still need to do the adjustments for the dollars when you calculate the standard deviation, but this year you will use these demographic factors instead of the risk scores. Another thing is that the member month threshold 12. So for any provider organization under a given attribution hierarchy in a given lines of business, if it has the member months less than or equal to the member months 12, you will need to move it to the unattributed tab first before you do the standard deviation calculations. Okay, before I go through the details of the example, just a couple of things I would like to highlight. First, for the standard deviation, again, make sure you report it under the demographic adjusted values this is different from the dollars by service category that you report in the tab 2 to tab 4, where the unadjusted dollars and demographic scores are reported separately. But for standard deviation, you need to report the demographic adjusted values. And second, when you calculate the standard deviation, it is based on the per member per month. It is not a standard deviation at the member level. So you will need to calculate the claims payments per PMPM first for every member before you do the standard deviation calculations. Third, when you do the standard deviation calculations, make sure you only use the claims payments and don't use the non-claims payment for a standard deviation. The non-claims payments sometimes are very difficult to be allocated at the member level. That's why we only use the claims payment for the standard deviation. And the last thing, when you calculate the standard deviation, make sure you use the equation for the population standard deviation, which means the denominator is the big N, and don't use the equation for the sample standard deviation where the denominator is N-1. We will talk about that later in this example. Okay, let's talk about this example. So this example is one pair in one line of business, commercial for claims. You can use this example for all other lines of business. The logic is the same. So for step 1, the first thing you need to do is attribute the members to appropriate provider organizations using the attribution hierarchy methodology based on the member months. So for the members that are unable to attribute to any provider organization, you will group them in the unattributed member month category. A few things for step 1. So first, member 1 in this example has the first 8 months with other payers where you probably don't have any visibility about their payments. In this case, you don't need to worry about the payments for these first 8 months. You will only use the payment for the last 4 months that the member is covered under your plan and are attributed to the payments are attributed to the hospital system Z. Second, let's see the member 5. So it is very possible that a member switch from one provider to another provider organization in the same calendar year. In this case, you will have 2 PMPMs for this member 5, where one PMPM is for hospital Z and the other PMPM is to Main Street provider group. Similar to the member 7, the members change from one provider organization to unattributed category. In this case, you will also have 2 PMPMs for member 7. Okay, let's move to step 2. Once you have all the member months that are attributed to the proper places, the step 2 is to calculate the demographic adjusted PMPM for members. For example, for member 1, the pair only has the last 4 months claims payment for member 1. So the average unadjusted claims PMPM is calculated by summing up all the dollars for the 4 months, and then the sum is divided by 4 to get the average claims PMPM. And then this is the unadjusted value. So to get the demographic adjusted value, you will simply use this 225 divided by the demographic score, which is 129 in this case. And then you will get the adjusted value, which is 174.42. You will do the same calculations for all other members, but just remember that for members 5 and members 7, because they switch from one provider organization to another provider organization, so you will have 2 values, 2 claims PMPMs for these members. That's for step 2. Now we are moving to step 3. Okay, so after you have the average demographic adjusted claims PMPM, the step 3 is to calculate the total member months and the average demographic adjusted claim PMPM by line of business, by provider organization, and by attribution hierarchy. So for member months in unattributed category, you will count the total member months and then calculate the average demographic adjusted claim PMPM by line of business. Let's use the hospital Z as an example. So to get the total member months for the hospital Z, it is simply to sum up all the member months from member 1 to member 3 in the step 2. So you will get 28 for the hospital Z. I want to note here that if a provider organization ending up with the total member months smaller or equal to 12, then all the dollars and member months will go to the unattributed category. This is slightly like HR work for this year. Okay, to get the demographic adjusted total claims expenses, you will sum up all the adjusted dollars for member 1 to member 3. So for member 1, it would be 4 multiply 174.42, which you find it from the step 2. And then for member 2, it would be 12 member months multiplied to 67.42. And for member 3, it will be member months 12 and multiply to 63.61. And by summing up all these dollars, you will get 7,069.89. This is the total expenses. And then to get the demographic adjusted PMPM, you will use the total claims expenses divided by the total member months. And then you will get the 252.5 here. So in the standard deviation equation, you will see the big N, which is the total member months you see in the step 3. And then X bar, which is the demographic adjusted claims PMPM in step 3. Also, you will see the XI, which is the average demographic adjusted claims PMPM in step 2. Okay. Oh, one thing I want to note here is that for the XI, the average demographic adjusted PMPM, XI is not the actual dollar amounts you pay for the member months on a given year. Let's move to the step 4. Yeah, so you see the XI here. It's not the actual dollar amounts you pay for the member on a given year. It's actually the PMPM value for that member. The reason we use the average instead of the actual dollar is that the given months in that given month is that our standard deviation is trying to capture the variation between different members. We don't want the variation within one member, but different months. So that's why we use the same value for the member. So in most of the case, one member will have only one XI, but of course, if, for example, the member 5 or member 7, they switch from one provider org to another provider org, then they will have 2 XI when you do the standard deviation calculation. And for standard deviation calculation, you see the equation here. You can use this equation whatever software you are using, but just refer to this equation, or if you are using the Excel function, you can use the stdev.p, this function to do the population standard deviation calculation. So that's for step 4. Let's move to our last step. So once you have the standard deviation calculated, the last step is just to report the standard deviation in a template. So if the standard deviation is for a given provider organization, then you will report it in tab 3. And if the standard deviation is for the unattributed member month, then you will report them in tab 4. Any questions for standard deviation calculations? Hearing none, I will hand it back to Chen. Thanks, Chen.
All right, thanks, Yishan. And as she noted, that that walkthrough document, that Excel we just went over, is uploaded to the cost growth target data submission website. All right, so now I'm going to share the template again and finish walking through those tabs. All right, so we walked through TME all, the subset of spending that's attributable to providers, and then the subset of spending that's not able to be attributed to providers. Yishan just did the walkthrough of how the standard deviation is calculated. Now we're on tab number 5, market enrollment. Market enrollment, it's another way for us to look at how the member months are diversified in your membership. One thing I'll note is there are 8 market enrollment categories. These are not the same thing as the line of business code. The line of business code is how you report spending in the TME tabs. The market enrollment is different. As you can see, just, you know, these first 5 categories are all commercial categories, and duals are in one dual category. So that's the market enrollment tab. We also collect pharmacy rebate information. So pharmacy rebates are going to be stratified by reporting year and line of business code. The layout is the same as last year. If it is visible, we are looking for medical pharmacy rebates and then retail pharmacy rebates split up. However, if that level of granularity isn't available to you, you can go ahead and use this column number 5, RXR05, to just give us the total amount. There is a new optional field in this tab. Some payers are able to provide rebates at the provider organization level. So if that is you, you could denote the provider organization name in here. There in the 2022 manual, there is an example of how to correctly populate these fields. For instance, maybe you have pharmacy rebates just as a whole that you can report, not, you know, at the provider org level, but maybe you have some pharmacy rebates where you could link to a provider organization. You could, these dollars should be mutually exclusive per unique reporting year and line of business. So that you are able to do that. Payers are also able to report the exact same way they reported last year, just ignoring this data column. All right. And okay, so here we are in our last data input slide. So this is the provider ID slide. So this is a tab we have in Oregon to help us with the merging of the multiple payer files. So we have over 30 data reporting entities that submit data to the state. And as you can imagine, when we go make the statewide file, it can get really tricky linking up provider organizations. So this is the solution we've devised. So in the provider org Tme tab, you have your provider organization name. It's a free text field. Whatever each unique provider name that is in this tab must show up in provider ID here. Linked to these groups, you could provide a provider org TIN. If there are multiple TINs, maybe there is a subgroup that operates under the umbrella of this large provider organization. Maybe that group has its own TIN. We need those TINs too. So you could have multiple rows with the same organization name, but with unique TINs. And we've had a lot of good luck in the file submission last year in using this information to create our statewide file. All right, so those are the 7 data input tabs. The rest of this the rest of this Excel, I'm not going to go over so much, but I just want to note there is the reference tabs, line of business code, attribution hierarchy code. These are the demographic tables that you will, whose factors you will use to apply to your membership when you are getting the standard deviation value and getting that average or weighted average demographic score value. The last couple tabs are new validation tabs. I'm not going to go through them in this part of the webinar. We did take snapshots and we'll go through how to use these tabs later in the PowerPoint. So that is the data submission template for this year. And I'm going to hand it back to Gerandi to send us back to the PowerPoint. And Gerandi, I'll tell you how many slides we can skip. All right, okay. Can you go to slide 26? So folks should feel free to peruse the slides we just skipped over on their own time. It's basically the same walkthrough, but without my verbal comments. If you want, you could review the video with those slides open side by side, and I think that will help a little bit. Okay, so I just wanted to show this slide talking about lines of business. So when you're reporting health spending in those claims buckets and in those non-claim buckets, you'll stratify them by year, provider organization, line of business code, and hierarchy. So line of business code, we go into the definitions on manual pages 38 through 39, but we do have 6 of them. And I want to specifically call out that line of business code 5 and 6, line of business code 5 is Medicare expenses for dual eligible members. Code 6 is Medicaid expenses for dual eligible members. This is where we have a slight tweak in our reporting. So for payers reporting in line of business code 5 or 6, you will be using paid amounts, not allowed amounts. Everything else, you are reporting dollars in the file using on an allowed amount basis. But for 5 and 6, we have to use paid amounts. And as I said before, that's due to some quirks in how we operate and do duals payments in Oregon. So specifically for Medicaid CCOs who are the secondary payer, you should report those dollars in the file and report those dollars on a paid amount basis. Are there any questions on that or template topics? There's still a lot of webinar to go, so you can totally hold your questions till the end. Okay. Oh, I see we have a question in the chat. Is there any future consideration to move the TIN field in tab 7 to tab 3 to eliminate tab 7 altogether? We can't do that because that would blow up tab 3 by quite a bit. Because one provider organization, which exists in one row in tab 3, it could have multiple rows in tab 7 if there are like other TINs nested under that entity. So right now, I think we've explored options, and that is the most efficient way to collect that data for us. Thanks for the question. Let's go to the next tab. All right, so we're not going to really get into this, but this is just a general overview of the different claims service categories. So if you'll remember, we have claims data fields. There are 9 of them. You could look on manual pages 39 to 43 for the descriptions. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see we have non-claims payments, payment categories as well. And we have 6 of those. Next slide, please. All right. And you can find the definitions in the manual on those pages listed there. Let's scroll ahead, Gerandi. The next couple slides are on standard deviation, but we went through that. Folks could feel free to read through these slides. We went through market enrollment and pharmacy rebates. Let's stop on slide 36. All right, this is probably a familiar visual to people that have been with us for a while. This is kind of a diagram outlining how members could be attributed to a provider, how that provider might be, that individual provider person could be attributed to a larger provider organization. Just to remind folks, I think everybody probably knows it here, but this program is looking for attributed health spending to the highest provider organization level. We're not looking at individual providers or anything right now. We're looking at the provider entity level, the provider organization level. Next slide, please. And this kind of gives you an idea of what that tab 7 could look like. You could have hospital system Z in tab 3 in one row, but there might be other clinics, other subgroups operating under that hospital system Z. So your tab 7 might look like this. You might have multiple rows with hospital system Z as the org name with unique different TINs. And that, again, that helps us with merging of the 30+ payer files, because there might be another payer that reports, a provider org with TIN number 4 that should belong under the hospital system Z umbrella. Next slide. All right. So again, just after that Excel overview, you probably have an idea of the linkages between multiple tabs. You can see our 3 Tme tabs. We like to say 2 equals 3 plus 4 because the health spending in tab 3 and the health spending in tab 4 should equal the spending in tab 2, which is the Tme All tab. You can see here also member months from Tme All should nest into the member months that you report in the market enrollment category. And then looking at that green text, you can see how tab 3 and tab 7 are related. And that is that each unique provider entity in tab 3 must also exist in tab 7. All right, are there any questions before we head into the manual? I am noting the time. We've got about 30 minutes left, so I think we're okay.
Is this presentation going to be on the website as well?
Yes, it will be.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. All right, let's go into some manual topics. Next slide. And you could skip ahead 2 slides. Yeah. All right. So in our manual, every time you see this icon, well, I should back up for a second. The manual provides guidance to payer technical staff on how you should be assembling the data. There are certain areas where our guidance is really strict, like you must compile it or extract it this way, but there are a lot of areas where there is flexibility in how payers report. And every time you see sort of this little icon, this little kind of like adjustment icon, that's an area with payer flexibility. So we want to call out some of those areas in this webinar with you folks today. Next slide. So the first one is member attribution. So for the capturing this data in a total cost of care approach, we are having members attributed to provider entities using a primary care based member attribution hierarchy. We have 3 levels. The first one is member selection, and that is where members actively select a primary care provider. Attribution level 2 is attribution via a contract arrangement between the payer and the provider. And attribution level 3 is utilization. So if members cannot be attributed using level 1 or level 2, payers using the member's utilization could still attribute some people. If you look on manual pages 11 through 16, there are a lot more details about this tier 3 utilization. But yes, I think I'll leave it at that for member attribution. And then lastly, of course, members who can't be attributed in any way, you can go ahead, aggregate their costs, and report that spending in tab 4, the unattributed Tme tab. Next slide. This is, we can skip this slide. This is just showing that schematic again of how members could be attributed to a PCP, but eventually you'll want to roll all of that up to the highest provider entity, provider organization level as possible. Next slide. All right, so these tables aren't in the manual, but the manual section for spending adjustment is revised, as some of you may have already noticed on manual pages 17 through 18. But the demographic factors for you to use will be provided in the CGT1 template itself as you saw earlier in the webinar. It's one of those 3 reference tabs. Next slide. There are exclusions and inclusions for TME. More detail is explained on manual pages 21 through 22. There are certain types of spending we cannot accept. A big one is standalone vision or dental. Unless, you know, something you've got like dental benefits baked into your physical medical plan, we do not collect that data. There is more information in the manual of what's included, what's excluded. We want to call out that Medicaid CCO specific guidance is on page 22. There is a table 5 in the manual also that lists other items that payers should exclude from TME. ACA risk transfer payments, COVID-related funds that are not paid to providers, gym memberships, things like that. This is not a comprehensive list. If there is something that you're not sure about and it's not addressed in the manual, go ahead and email OHA at our program email right there, and we'll figure out where to take it from here and whether we need to alert other data submitters as well. Next slide. All right, data completeness. So no change from last year. So we are allowing for a 180-day runout period after December 31st of the measurement year. Reminder that you are reporting spending based on date of service. So not the paid date or the reconciled date. There's some guidance on claims completeness and non-claims estimation. I'm not gonna read that word for word on these slides, but if you'll remember on the cover page, there are cover page questions asking you to provide us claims completeness information. So we have a handle on that, and as last time, we reserve the right to request payers to calculate IBNR or to provide us more information on how you calculated your claim spending. Next slide. All right. So this is for carve-out services and vendor payments. There may be some estimation in these costs in your TME data spending. So just some things we want to note in terms of these carve-out services and vendor payments. You do have some flexibility in how you report those to us, but in general, if the service is a covered benefit, you should report the spending to us in the file. And depending on your visibility into the data, you could estimate the spending using encounter data if you have it. Or if you don't have access to claims or encounter data, you could estimate using a reasonable estimate of spending per member per service. And as long as you detail to us how you did that estimation in that tab 1 cover page. This might entail you looking at the population you do see and kind of making an estimation based on that. I know we've done that. Next slide. As for administrative fees, in these payments, they should be included or excluded in accordance with how you report on financial forms like the NAIC medical loss ratio forms. However, if you have a contractor, if you have a vendor that is strictly providing administrative functions, those should not be included in the TME spending. We are not looking for those costs in our total medical expenses reporting. Next slide. All right, so here we go into data collection and the validation process. All right, so next slide, please, Gerandi. So you can submit the data to us as we did last year. These are Excel files via our email right here. You could look on the manual page 28 for final file naming conventions and other process topics. I will note we were able to accept some payer files in a consolidated file, as long as, well, maybe I won't get into that. It's outlined in the manual, and I don't want to cause any confusion. Essentially, if you're listed as a data reporter, we are expecting a file from you. There may be instances where you need to split your data reporting into separate files, or you need to provide data to us in one cost growth target file, but for maybe 2 data reporter entities. We can talk about that if the need arises. I know if this is confusing for some folks, you can completely ignore what I just said. And if you sort of know what I'm talking about, yes, please email us and we'll figure out what to do for this year so we're able to anticipate your files in the correct amount of files. All right, next slide. So let's get into data validation. So our data validation process consists of 3, we're calling them 3 stages. Stage 1 is the initial validation. We're looking at data completeness. Are those 7 tabs filled out? Is the data between the stage 1 takes a lot of 5 very for collecting this data and validating this data. So that's stage 1. Stage 2 is a more detailed validation process. We're looking, here is where we make all the fun stuff. We look at the trend outputs, we look at the service category trends, we see outliers and such. These stage 2 outputs are the same outputs we share with you in our stage 3 meeting. And speaking of stage 3 is our last validation stage. This is our communication and finalization stage. We have a sit down with you, we discuss the outputs, we resolve any questions we may have or you may have with how we are viewing the data. We finalize the data and say, consider it good to go for statewide analysis. Another thing I'll note here is that each validation process must happen for each unique file. And if we can go to the next slide, you could see stage 1, 2, and 3 broken out even more. So stage 1, we sort of talked about as being the busiest stage. It's also where a lot of our time gets locked up because we do want to do a back and forth with payers to make sure that payers know what we're expecting and why we're expecting it that way. And so based on our experience doing all this with you folks for the first time, we made a couple of changes. If you can go to the next slide, Gerandi. And the changes are those data validation tabs. So if you look at that first pink line of text, this year, payers are able to do a self-check of the stage 1 validation checks before you even submit your file to OHA. And we'll go through those tables in just a minute. So you can see the stage 1 checks. If you see that you make it all through, your data's in there, all of those validation tables look good, then you can submit your file to OHA. We will still do the stage 1 validation check, and hopefully nothing will show up, and we can, funnel it down this workflow to stage 2 and produce those stage 2 outputs. So if you follow along the workflow, the second line of pink text, this year, so the stage 1 back and forth took a while, scheduling meetings and times to discuss data clarification topics, and even those stage 3 meetings, like we're all very busy people. Getting all the right people in the same room can take a long time. So what we're doing this year is pre-scheduling meetings upon receipt of your cost growth target file. This will give a timeline for our staff and you, so we know we always have a check-in point not too far along in the future. This meeting, if something shows up in the stage 1 validation checks, this meeting will be a stage 1 validation meeting, and we'll go through what were the errors we saw and what we expect in a resubmission. If everything goes well, this meeting will be a stage 3 meeting, and we'll give you the stage 2 output. You'll have a chance to look at that, and we'll come to that meeting with, wearing our stage 3 hats and ready to resolve any clarification issues to finalize the file. You could see at the end of the stage 3 workflow, if the data is accepted, we consider you done in terms of data validation, and the file is, can join the herd with the other ready for statewide analysis files. Sometimes in a stage 3, something does pop up, maybe those stage 2 outputs, you see a trend and you think, oh, well, that can't be right. We need to go back and look at that. A resubmission is still available at this stage. And if that happens, then we will go through the whole process again with that new resubmitted file. Oh, one thing before I go on, the stage 3 is also where we will have some of the initial target assessment chat. If you as the payer are above the cost growth target, this is where we will first get to talk about that, but we'll definitely have more discussion if it needs to be had. I will say with the data this year, data submitted to us this September, payer entities and provider organization entities will be named in subsequent reports, but there is no performance improvement plan or anything like that. There's none of that accountability, but there is going to be more detailed reporting, and that's that payer and provider entities will be named above the threshold. Next slide, and I'm looking at the time, so I'll try to be efficient going through these last couple slides. Next slide, Gerandi. All right, so I'm gonna go through these. So you can see there's 3 validation tabs. For you as a data submitter, you're really only going to be interested in TME validation and provider check. TME validation is probably will be the most fun one for you to check. Next slide. All right, so the new TME validation tab you'll see has 4 validation tables. All of these tables are auto-populated. You do not need to enter anything in them. You just need to check them to make sure, zeros are there, or I'll, the results are on the right-hand column of this table. And I think all of them is that the value should be 0. Next slide, we'll look at table 1 really quickly. So as Yishan noted, a new thing we're doing this year is that we are moving any row of data in that tab 3 attributed provider tab, any row of data that is 12 or that has member months of 12 or less than 12, they should be moved to the unattributed tab. So this table auto calculates your provider tab, that tab 3, and it'll show you if there are any rows that should be moved to unattributed. So the result for this table 1 is that you should all see zeros down the table. Next slide. Table 2 is checking Tme all, which is the whole overview, and then the nested Tme Prov and Tme unattributed. So per year and per line of business, the member months, so this little table should also include member months. The member months should line up. The claims category payments and the non-claims category payments should all align with Tme all. So essentially in these boxes, we're looking at a value of 0, that's good, value of 0, or something close to 0. We know, based on rounding and stuff, we might see a little bit of a discrepancy, but generally it should be 0. If we go to the next slide, table 3 looks at the demographic score. So in the provider, the Tme Prov and Tme unattributed, the demographic scores should align with your calculated weighted average score in Tme all. So this table just looks, it just does a simple subtraction and sees if there's any discrepancy. So the value we're looking for in the difference column is 0 or something very, very close to 0. Next slide. Okay, so the next slide is so we're still on Tme validation table 4. This is the last validation table. This is just making sure that the member months from Tme all is aligned to the market enrollment tab. You could see how we're kind of nesting the line of business codes to the market enrollment codes. And that highlighted column of difference, we're looking for a difference of 0. Well, I guess it shouldn't be close to 0. It should be 0. Next slide. All right. So this is the provider check validation tab. Again, this is auto-populated. There is no input needed, and there's just one table on this tab. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so I think I've said this multiple times, but every unique provider org name in the 3rd tab must be matched in the 7th tab. And this check essentially just checks for that. So where you see that yellow box, providers missing in provider ID tab, that value should be 0. If the value is not 0, you'll have to scroll down this tab to see the highlighted red cell. And you can see the cell will pop up, it'll show up as red, and it'll say not in provider ID. So that lets you know that, oh, I put a provider org in my tab 3, but forgot to insert it and the associated TINs into tab 7. This was also a common place where we got tripped up a lot this first go round. So hopefully this validation table fixes that, and we shortened the amount of time we spend on validation. Speaking of time, if you could go to the next tab. All right, so we are hoping to drastically reduce, well, not drastically, but we are hoping to reduce the amount of time on data validation with this 2022 submission cycle. We're doing that via these validation tabs that you, the payer, can check. We're also doing it via these pre-scheduled meetings. So we already have meetings on the books. I will start reaching out to people maybe late July in August, so we could get meeting holds on everybody's calendars. As we've said before, files are due early September. We're hoping to have validation meetings throughout the fall, the rest of the year, and fingers crossed, aiming to validate all our 30+ files by end of the year. I think we can do it. I know from speaking with everybody in the stage 3 meetings, I know this first year was a little tough, especially if it was the first time you've done it, but having gone through it once and learning what we did, I think this year we'll be able to operate much more efficiently and thus much faster. All right, are there any questions?
I do have a question, Trang. This is Danielle from Cascade.
Yes.
There was a mention in, I think it was the Tme validation, where if a provider in line of business and year have less than 12 member months, that it needs to be moved to the unattributed tab. Just wanting to make sure I'm understanding correctly, then would that mean that those member months and claim spend need to be rolled up into the unattributed and a recalculation of standard deviation, et cetera?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Yes. And I know we're at 2:29. So if which is the end of this webinar. Can you go to the next slide, Gerandi? I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And the next slide, if you want to look at any supporting submission material, you can just visit our data submission webpage. Our new template and manual are up there. We've made revisions to the standard deviation, the facts. I think everything else is kind of the same. And as always, next slide. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to contact us using our program email. We're here for you. And also noting, I'm going to send out to our data submitter contacts meeting holds for our office hours this summer. Our office hours are July 18th for an hour, and then we have another one August 8th for another hour. And folks can just come to that with any questions, or even just to hang out and hear if somebody else's question might help you in your submission. All right, and with that, oh, it's 2:31. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar. We will post this recording and the slides on the data submission website, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks, Trang.
Thank you.
Everyone. And you could stop recording, Gerandi.
Thanks, Trang.
Thanks, bye.